It is only a transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Carol Ann is not like those she's with. She is a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane.
Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Talking to the Dead podcast. So before I start this week, I just want to tell you what's been going on, because it seems every week now I get some idea a few days out, sometimes more than a few days, about what potentially is going to happen on the Wednesday afternoon. And most definitely the very strong feeling came through about time. And it's a subject that's fascinating to me, and I think myself and others who correspond with me are very fond of that Christopher Nolan film Interstellar. And as you might know if you've seen the film, it does its best to try to explain how time doesn't really exist in space. And it's a construct that we've created in terms of understanding our earthly realms, I suppose. And the movie did a wonderful job, I think, of actually showing how a human who had gone through a black hole and essentially had managed to go beyond the normal reality that we have here, and had entered a multi-dimensional world where suddenly everything could be seen simultaneously in all the different dimensions. An incredibly difficult thing for someone to film, and obviously only somebody like Christopher Nolan, who just did Oppenheimer, would even stand a chance of trying to do that. And he did, and he did it quite brilliantly, and he managed to show how, according to physicists' theories, this is an entirely possible scenario, that outside of our dimension, in a multidimensional universe, past, present, and future is simultaneous. And I've been thinking a lot about that, and I think I realized that this week it was going to be all about that. And I think so it is. But I was, of course, very nervous about who I could ask to come along and talk about this, because I don't really know much about quantum physics or cosmology or any of these sciences. And I certainly don't feel familiar enough to call people up like Einstein or whoever it might be. So I was really at a complete loss as to who may pop through. But then that all changed this morning, because on my way to work, it just suddenly popped in my head. And I think it was probably happening in my dreams last night as well, that I did actually know a physicist. And I couldn't remember his name, but essentially he was a Romanian in exile in London. He'd escaped, I think, Ceausescu's regime in the, late 70s, early 80s. Late 70s, I suppose, because I must have met him in 1980. And he worked as a kitchen porter in a very large 5-star hotel where I was training at the time. And he was washing dishes, and quite often on a quiet night, we'd sit around and talk. And I just realized, of course, he was extremely intelligent. His English wasn't so strong, but clearly he was very intelligent. And he told me that in his home country, he had been a physicist. I'm not sure whether he was a quantum physicist or whatever he was. And he had to escape. And when he escaped, he couldn't find a job, obviously, as an academic in London, and he did the next best thing, which was to become a pot cleaner. And so he was an amazing guy, and quite often the nature of this restaurant business was that there weren't many guests sometimes, and we could sit around, or I could sit around with him, sometimes alone, and he could just talk to me for hours, I remember, about very complicated theories of relativity and goodness knows what else. And he came through this morning. I have no idea what happened to him, so I'd be interested to find out. I mean, this was a long time ago. He's clearly passed on since then. and maybe we can find out a little bit more, and maybe he's going to be the best person to help me, because, to be honest, he managed to explain extremely complicated theories very simply, and he may be able to help us here with this understanding of what happens in other dimensions. So as usual, due to the wonders of the magics of podcasting, I can pause you and spend 5 minutes or so seeing if I can't contact him. Okay, so I most definitely again feel that I have somebody here, and I'd be very interested to know who it is, and could it be you? And yes, and I'm afraid I forgot your name. He said his name is Emil. Now I remember that, Emil. And yes, Emil, so really nice to be able to speak to you again. So what happened to you? He said that he'd had a tremendous amount of bad health. When I knew him, he was already pretty sick. And actually quite interesting you mentioned that, Emil, because I do remember now you mentioning to me that you had some illness. He said, yes, he ended up contracting all sorts of diseases because of where he'd come from in Romania. And he said that the country was terrible in the late 70s. He said that there was tremendous malnutrition and poverty, a lot of issues created by the communist government then, he said. And he said that when he came over to England, he already was very sick. And he said that was the main reason why he wanted to escape, because he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in total poverty in Romania. But he realized when he got there that he wasn't going to live for very long. And he got a job in order to be able to pay his way. And that's how he got his job at the hotel, cleaning pots. So Emil, how much longer did you live after I met you in 1980? He said he managed to make it to about 1985. So not long after we met. Yeah. Okay, so tell me, why are you popping in to speak to me? Why did this come about? And he said, well, mainly he says that where he is now in a multidimensional space, as with people who've come previously through to the podcast, he is not so much the Emil that I remember, but he is part of the entity that also incorporates, he says, a huge number of scientists and physicists and mathematicians, musicians, people who are very particularly interested in helping people on Earth and help discovering things. Okay, so I think we've been there before with I think we had Bach last week, and we've had a few other people who've come through. So why are you here? Why not Einstein or somebody else who's famous that I might have heard of? And he's saying no, we're all here. They are all here. Einstein is here. He said it's not a problem if I want to speak to them through him. He said that I might have a problem speaking directly with them, because in this case I have a connection with him. He says, with Emil. So I have that good connection with you, and that's been made possible, I suppose, because we've physically met each other. And he said yes, and he said it's quite an interesting thing because you've obviously met other people through Gabriel or through your spirit guide, Titan, and they had to lead the introduction. In this particular case, it's much easier because we already have a connection. We shook hands, we talked, we spent time together. You're already aware of my entity and my consciousness. Okay, well, that's good. It's funny. You're immediately putting a thought in my mind. We should tell the story. I think we'll tell the story. Can we tell the story, Emil? He said yes. He said there was this great story that he was talking to me one time, and this is me relating this story, and he said that's fine. Yeah, I asked you about the theory of relativity, and you told me, and I didn't realize it at the time, but it was actually something that Albert Einstein had actually said, and it was the way that you said relativity could be explained easily to a child. And he said it was basically, if you're courting a nice lady, an hour seems like a second, but when you sit on a red hot cinder, a second seems like an hour. I never forgot that. And I'm sorry, I thought it was you, Emil. I didn't realize it came from Einstein. And you think, no, that's fine. It was a well-known thing. It's just probably at the time you didn't know about it. So tell me then, try to explain to me, Emil, how do I explain to my correspondents like Esther, who are fascinated in the idea of past, present, and future? How do I explain it? Explain what the real meaning of all of this is. Emil's speaking now, and actually he's showing me a piano, and he's showing me a sheet of music. It's actually two sheets of music, very, very complicated, full of, music notation, which I can't read, but I can see it's an extremely complicated piece of music, and it's sitting there on this piano. And he's now saying, he says, take that piece of music. And he wants to use the music analogy because that's something that we have been using quite a lot, and it's an extremely useful way to present complicated information to us because everyone in our dimension understands music. And he said that if you look at a piece of music, what you're seeing at that moment is in those 2 pages, that tune completely finished. It's a finished entity. It's been written. And he says that in your present time, you can actually see that as a finished piece of music. He said even if you're a gifted musician, you can probably read quite a lot of it simultaneously, not in the sort of normal way of being able to read it from beginning to end like you would play, but you can look at a piece of music. And he said, believe me, many musicians can actually almost, sometimes without them even realizing it, simultaneously hear the whole piece in their mind as if it's just been put in there. So you've got, when it's written down like that, he said, you've got a present situation where you can see the whole tune. He says that then when you start to play that tune, you have played it and it's not anymore being played when you stop. Therefore, the moment that you played it and you have stopped playing it, it has gone into what you consider to be your past. You have played that piece of music. But he said before you actually started playing, you could conceive of yourself playing that music. So in terms of your understanding of time, you were seeing the future. The future would be how that piece of music would be played by you. So in a simple example, he says, looking at a piece of music explains to you the present, the past, and the future. But it's all simultaneous because you're looking at one piece of paper which with notations, musical notations, that explain everything at the same time. He's saying what is quite interesting also is that to make it even more hard, he said there are possibilities of how you can play that piece of music. And when you finish playing the music, you can look back at a performance that you've given of that music and think, oh, I wish I had played that differently. And you can even change in your mind how you played it and reimagine how things could have been had you played it differently. You create probabilities for your past. Before you play it, you look at it and you can think, how am I going to play this? And you create probabilities based on how things are being perceived at the present moment. And then later on, as you're playing, you can play quickly, or you can play slowly, you can put different meanings into the notes. You can even play it backwards if you want to, but he said, or a different key, he says. But, that is the process of you playing the piece of music, planning the playing of the piece of music, looking back at how you played the piece of music. Therefore, again, you're showing all these infinite possibilities. And he said that's what he's learned is the possibilities, and that basically present, past, and future as we see it are all completely changeable. They contain continuous possibilities of how they could be. He said you can even change your past as you see it. You can change your present, which you're aware of, but you can change your future, because none of this is set, and there are almost infinite possibilities as to the way things could be. He said if that's not confusing enough for you, it's probably easier for you to think about it in your dreams. Because in your dreams, you don't have a sense of time. What could be years in a dream, when you wake up, you realize, well, I've only been asleep for a few hours. He said that's no mistake, because in your dreams you are going to a multidimensional reality where time is unimportant. He said that if you want to talk about the film Interstellar in terms of time, just to give you some example, how you can explain that time is not the same in every dimension. He said in that film, the concept of time dilation was introduced, which was when you went through a black hole, because of the incredible amount of gravity it contained, things moved incredibly slowly in terms of time. But back in Earth, it was 50, 60 years had passed. He says, Emil is saying that is a proven physical theory on our planet at the moment. People understand that. I think it's called the special theory of relativity. It's been observable by Earth scientists, and it of course exists in our reality. But he said in multidimensional space, which is what he wants to talk about, it's very, very easy for him to immediately be aware of everything that has ever happened, and it happens simultaneously, and he has to force himself, he's saying, to focus on my now in order to communicate with me. But by focusing on my now, he's also aware of my past, my now, and my future, and he's aware of everything simultaneously as well. So it takes a tremendous amount of effort, he says, to be able to focus enough to be able to communicate with me at the moment. Wow, so that's quite a lot to take in. So where you are now, Emil, how could you explain it again to me that there is no time as we see it? That is obviously a human construct, I get that. But you're seeing the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. How does that work? Emil is saying to me that actually also I've got that a bit wrong. He said that he doesn't just see the past, the present, and the future. He sees the probable pasts, which create many probable presents, and all these probable futures. These are all the decisions and the possibilities. This is what the world of multidimensional existence is all about. It's about being able to create almost unlimited possibilities for things to happen. And he says to try to make that simple for you. If you can imagine, he's saying actually, if you can imagine Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is known in our world as being almost perhaps the embodiment of evil, for having been responsible for killing, and he's saying many of his countrymen, because Emil said he was Jewish when he was Emil, and he was one of many Jewish people who he says were in tremendous trouble in Romania. And after the war, and as the Cold War came, Israel was doing its best to try to, he says, to rescue many people from Romania and repatriate them to Israel. And there was a tremendous problem, he said, that's part of the reason he also escaped Jewish people were being rounded up by the communist regime and sold for money to Israel. Okay, I had no knowledge of that. But he said, beyond all of that, he said, what is important to note, and something that he thinks is very worth saying. So he's saying that if you look at Adolf Hitler as being the embodiment of evil, he said that without being too controversial to people who are listening, he said that he's absolutely sure if you would speak to the entity that was Adolf Hitler, which he says is entirely possible if you want to sometime, he would explain to you that there were a bunch of reasons for his appearance on Earth and the way he behaved, which are beyond just the physical and emotional side of being Adolf Hitler, but that would also be to do with, he says, if you like, the grand design of things. But most importantly, Adolf Hitler had a whole range of different possibilities. In some possibilities, he never became a soldier, or some possibilities, he's saying that things would have turned out completely different, and he may not have persecuted Jewish people, gypsies, or intellectuals, or whatever else he was doing, and things would have turned out in a completely different way. There were so many possibilities for the way that even someone who's as renowned as Hitler could have turned out. Yeah, I see what you're explaining to me. So this is what you see, Emil. You can see not only the past and the present and the future of a person or a world event, but you can also see all the possibilities of how things, he's saying yes, how things could have turned out, or how things will turn out. And he says that being human is very much a question of making the choices that enable you to take certain roads based on certain actions. Some of these are, if you like, predestined because you've chosen originally a certain path. But he said you have still the choice when you're alive to take other routes and change that predestination. But he says in terms of where we are today and what we're talking about in terms of time and space, he said the very best way I can explain this is that where he is in a multidimensional space, he can see everything simultaneously, and he can see all the different possibilities of what could happen or may happen. And he's saying to me that's why it's important that he works with groups of particular scientists, because they can influence that particular probabilities are taken by people or by society. They can almost play, he says, like a game with the way things may or may not happen in order to be able to shape our reality. And he says our reality, it's very important for us to have a reality that enables us to grow and to nurture. And there are a lot of very concerned people in many dimensions, he says, who pay a particular attention to what's going on in our dimension in order to make sure that things turn out in a proper way. Okay. Is there anything else that you could tell me then about your dimensions, and how will we become aware of this, or are we supposed to become aware of all of this? Emil is saying, in terms of where we are now in Earth history, it's a very exciting time, and that's why he's getting very involved with all sorts of entities that have represented famous scientists. He's mentioning Stephen Hawking, because our understanding of physics and things at the quantum level, our understanding is changing so quickly. We're beginning to understand that there are different forces, he says, that are at a subatomic level, forces that we have given names to, but we still don't quite understand how it works. But he says what you do understand is that it does not work according to your traditional theories of physics. And that is because you are suddenly becoming, you're going into, he says, the realm of possibility rather than direct, observable past, present, and future. He said that's why he's mentioning it, because at that particular level, when you get really far down into the subatomic particle level, everything that we know will suddenly become multidimensional. Okay, could you say a little bit more about that? And he said, yes. He said, I'm sure you're aware that physicists in our community have said that they don't quite understand, but they know it's true. For instance, that at a particle level, a particle, for instance, could be in terms of distance almost, billions of miles apart from another particle, but it's connected to that particle. And if that particle sort of turns left, that other particle will turn left simultaneously. And he's saying that in our current understanding, we can see it now. We're observing that this can happen at a subatomic level, but it doesn't meet with any of our traditional scientific models and theories that would explain it. But it's happening. And he's saying also what's quite interesting is that people are realizing that just the pure act of observation of particles can almost make them disappear or appear. He said that's because your brain is creating a possibility when it observes these particles that will enable a particle to appear or to disappear. It's the power of your mind and your consciousness to be able to change things, because we all have that. He said we're all born with that. This is the world, the environment that he lives in, where he can change anything and he can create anything and he can control the probabilities of things happening. But he said you're just beginning to see in the earth level how this happens, because you are observing now things at the subatomic level that cannot be explained by human physics and science at this point. Okay, so why then, if we could see subatomic particles, explain again, why if I looked at it, would it react differently from if I didn't look at it, or observe it, I suppose you're saying? And he says, because it's your consciousness is affecting the smallest particles of existence and making it possible for them to do things through the power of your thoughts. You are, for instance, if you're wanting to observe a particle, you are creating that thought that you wish to observe that particle, and therefore that particle will react to that and it will be observable. You may equally think, consciously or subconsciously, that you don't wish to observe that particle. And at that point of discovery or observation, you cannot see it. He said that is the basis of multidimensional existence. That is what happens to us when we pass, when we leave our physical body. We return to this multidimensional world where we can make anything, create anything, and we can see everything simultaneously. That's interesting, Emil. Emil is now saying he just wants to close today's session, but he wants to talk about individuality. Okay. He's saying that the individual, you, me, the people who are listening to your podcast are all individuals that all have the individual freedom and choice to make things happen any way they wish. He says it's very hard sometimes at our level to understand how powerful this is, and that we as a society barely understand how the thoughts that we have can change our present situation and our future. But he says they can also change the past. He said that if you really concentrate hard enough on a past event, you can, in your mind, in your memory, change the outcome of that. And he says that in reality, if enough people do that, they can actually change the way Earth history has happened. He says you probably won't observe it so much, because then everything that has happened since then will be updated according to how people now remember it or have recorded it. He says in terms of the present, he says that doesn't need much explaining, because we're all very used to making decisions on a day-to-day basis about the present. But in terms of the future, again, we can completely change the potential futures that we're traveling on or traveling towards with the power of our mind. We can think about things in a different way. We can be positive about things. We can will things to happen. And he says, if you like, that's also the basis of a lot of the magic in our society, is this ability to be able to will things to change, to create things through the power of your thought. So he says, so lastly, I just wish to also, while I'm touching upon that, I want to talk about these matters of coincidence that we've talked about before, and I know that various people have written to me about that. I know Esther's written to me about that, asking me about all the various coincidences that have seemed to have happened in her life in relation to her past husband, how numbers pop up and how coincidences seem to have some amazing cosmic purpose. So tell me, Emil, what do you want to say about that? Yes, he's saying that these are not coincidences as such. They are messages, and he says you've heard that before. They are a form of communication. Various things before you become human have been decided. You've decided to go along and do a life in a particular way for a particular reason, and for that purpose, he says, you set up little roadmap for how things will move forward. Now, within that roadmap, you can take different alternative routes to get to your destination, but you're going to eventually get to your destination, hopefully, he says, whichever routes that you take. But at these various convergences where you could take a different route from the way you were going to take your route, you have slotted in, and your fellow souls who are on that journey with you have slotted in certain things that will be very obvious to you. They will be things you were thinking as coincidences or certain numbers, or things that you will look back on and think, wow, if it hadn't been for that, I would have done this. But because I hadn't seen that, I did that. And he said, yes, that's exactly what it's all about. He said it's a form of help. It's a sort of a route planning for you. It's a way of you being able to keep on the right focus, being able to understand also, and the people around you who you've chosen to be with, what you plan to do in the first place. He said, obviously, because of the nature of us as humans, he said, we tend to look back at that. We tend to look at a past event. And we tend to say, oh, I now can see various things that have happened and the coincidences. But he says that is also slightly wrong, because if you look hard enough right now in your present, you will see all around you these numbers, these coincidences, these things that remind you of something, but they can also remind you what will happen and decisions you need to make. Some people call that premonition, or being able to see into the future, if you like. But he says, but they are just there as your guide. They're there to show your connection with people, the communication that you have with people, to give you a bit of structure as you move forward in your life. Wow, that was really interesting, Emil, and thank you very much for helping me with that. And I think the very best person to explain it to me in a very simple way. And thank you very much for coming through. And I certainly hope we see you again one day. And Emil is saying that it's his pleasure. And he says that he realizes that by putting these words into my mind and the things that I'm saying, I'm reaching a lot of people, and that will have an effect. That will enable people to change the routes that they're on, and he thinks that's a very important thing to do. He's mentioning that yes, he died too soon. And as a scientist himself, he was fascinated by all these things, and he said he wished that he did know what he knows now then. But he said that's again also part of the process that he's in now, and part of the process that happens when you pass. After a period of adjustment, he said, it doesn't happen straight away. And, it does require, he says, that you sometimes have to live a number of lives. That's just the way it is. You tend to move to different dimensions. Oh, he says he wants to also just to mention, while we're talking about dimensions, he said some people, again, are very confused and they think there are maybe 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 dimensions, he said. He said that's not true either. He said there are limitless dimensions. There are infinite dimensions, because always beyond the dimension that you think is the end is going to be another. But he says, again, that's because we find it very difficult to understand the concept of time and space beyond the way we understand it in our human world. But he says, obviously out there are limitless dimensions that you can move through. It's never ending. Okay, thank you, Emil, and thank you everyone for listening.